Loki was, yes, a comic book villain and somebody with magical powers, and someone who had to, these emotions had to read on a big scale, but also, if you boiled it down, there was something very, very kind of human about the things his grievances. Thor, 2011, directed by Kenneth Branagh. 4 months of auditioning, I think, in 2009. A big leap for me, from making very small films in the UK and working in the theatre, and suddenly in the next Marvel Studios picture after Iron Man. It was a moment of adjustment and a kind of just, I felt like I'd won the lottery, and it was kind of, it had the whole thing had a very special atmosphere. I had worked with Kenneth Branagh before. We had acted together in a television series on the BBC called Wallander, and we had also acted together on stage in London in a Chekhov play called Ivanov. This was my first time being directed by him, but we had a kind of understanding as actors, and I felt very grateful to him that he was able to somehow support my casting to the studio. It was a kind of amazing and extraordinary and unprecedented process of working on a project of this scale, working with a stunt department and working with visual effects on blue screen and green screen, on sets the size of which I had never seen. But I was a fan of these movies too, and it was such a joy for the first time to be inside the process. But rather like any process of making a film, in the end it comes down to the atmosphere you create together as actors, and trying to tell a story and trying to tell it with, which is interesting and complex and sort of recognizable emotion, and hopefully it's funny and it's moving and it's touching, and it connects with people. And I could see from the first scripts that the story was really, there were two stories almost. One was on this epic, spectacular canvas, Asgard, a shining city in the sky with a rainbow bridge and a kind of intergalactic energy that connected it to other universes, that transported characters to new worlds, and this was a world of gods and monsters, a world from myth and legend. And we knew the film had to deliver on that scale. But inside it was a very small drama about a family, about a father and two sons. Ken Branagh sitting us down and saying, actually, this is what the film is it's about this family. And a father, two sons, their mother, and there are all sorts of fractures. If that happens to be the family, the royal family at the top of the universe, there's a very, very high stakes. But ultimately, they'll still have the same very relatable, very accessible family dynamics as any family on the planet. And so that became a very interesting psychological thing to explore about a triangle of Odin and his two sons, Thor and Loki, and Loki's sense of being marginalized or less favored than Thor, and why that should be. Was it just because he's the younger brother and therefore won't inherit the throne and all that responsibility? And then Loki finding out halfway through the film that he's actually adopted and wasn't even supposed to be there, and then feeling very betrayed and upset, and gives way to all kinds of vulnerability and anger and grievance and grief.
Love his son.
Yes.
Why? You were knee-deep in Jotun blood. Why would you take me?
You were an innocent child.
No. You took me for a purpose. What was it? Tell me!
And that's when he becomes an antagonist in a way, and that's that Thor and Loki fragment and split off and become adversaries.
I swear to you, Mother, that they will pay for what they've done today.
Loki!
Thor! I knew you'd return to us.
Why don't you tell her how you sent the destroyer to kill our friends, to kill me?
What?
Oh, it must have been enforcing Father's last command.
You're a talented liar, brother, always have been.
It's good to have you back.
And all of that was really rich material to get into, especially with these actors. You know, I remember that day that Loki finds out he's adopted, and it's a scene in the weapons vault, and it was it was a very small scene in terms of its kind of structure. And on the day, Kenneth Branagh and Anthony Hopkins, and I was there going, oh my God, working with Kenneth Branagh and Anthony Hopkins. And I also remember them kind of not able to talk to each other about how much they admired each other, so they came to me, which was quite sweet. And Anthony Hopkins telling me how much he admired Kenneth Branagh, and Kenneth Branagh telling me how much he admired Anthony Hopkins. I felt I was like a vessel for their kind of sheepishness about being able to be honest about that. But it was a big day, and it was a big day of big emotion, and I remember that scene became the anchor for the whole characterization.
You know, it all makes sense now why you favored Thor all these years. Because no matter how much you claim to love me, you could never have a frost giant sitting on the throne of Asgard.
Loki was, yes, a comic book villain and somebody with magical powers, and someone who had to, these emotions had to read on a big scale, but also, if you boiled it down, there was something very, very kind of human about the things his grievances. And last but not least, my first film with Chris Hemsworth, with whom I made a very fast and firm friendship, because we were playing brothers in this enormous thing, and it felt like we were brothers by the end in some way. He was the only other person who understood what the experience had been like. He was the only other person who, I came back and friends of mine were like, how was it? And it was always hard to explain, and there's one person who knows, and it was Chris. And we've always shared that, really, because it's a kind of a life-changing moment for both of us. Avengers, the first one, 2012, and it was the first big team-up superhero film. And I remember reading the script and I was thinking, okay, there are 6 of them: Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Black Widow, Hulk, and Hawkeye. And there's one of me. And the way this film is structured is the Avengers have to win. And we all want to root for the Avengers. And it was so brilliant because it was almost like Loki's superpower, which is his mercurial shapeshifting, and his capacity to manipulate situations, his wit, his charm, his sort of strategic intelligence, is used to turn these individual characters against each other initially, so that he has the upper hand. And then in the second act, they actually all unite as a team to stop him. And I remember thinking, I've got to really lean into being a pure antagonist in this one. Because the balance of the film needs to be such that you just need Loki. Loki needs to, I wanted the audience to cheer at the end when he gets Hulk smashed. And I think they did. Anyway.
Enough! You are all of you beneath me. I am a god, you dull creature. And I will not be bullied by that.
Puny god.
It was an amazing experience because it was the first one, and I think there was a sense of, with Robert and Chris Hemsworth and Chris Evans, that they were kind of almost relieved to share the responsibility for carrying the film. and a kind of uncertainty about whether we could all pull it off. When I guess the following spring in 2012, when the film came out and it kind of became what it became, we were all so honored, I guess. We were so honored that it seemed to work and it seemed to connect, and that was a very special experience to share with them, because the Avengers suddenly occupied a position in the culture, which they went on to, you know, they carried on to the second film and the third film, and the Avengers are this team that everybody in the world has heard of. And I was really honored that I was there kind of for the first go around, and they were all so kind, and it was a fun team to be around. And what I've been amazed by is, because I had a little break from the MCU for a bit while it expanded, and the MCU seemed to get braver, and the film seemed to get bigger and more ambitious, and with Doctor Strange and Black Panther and the characters from Wakanda and Ant-Man and the Guardians of the Galaxy, and I was sort of watching from the sidelines going, I'm so proud of all these actors and what they're doing. This is great. Watching with my popcorn on the opening night, and it was really fun to just feel a part of it in some way. And then it kind of culminates with Infinity War and Endgame, where you see, you know, all these individual films and the threads of the Infinity Stones. It all kind of crystallizes in this moment of all the Avengers against Thanos, and it was just such an extraordinary experience to be a part of.
The rightful king of Jotunheim, god of mischief, do hereby pledge to you my undying fidelity.
What I always used to say was, like, Taika took everything that had been built before and just added all of his own kind of sense of humor and style, and the bells and the whistles, and, you know, there were fireworks, and he was able to respect what had gone before and say, but this is my reading. And it was so playful and so irreverent. It was just so fresh. And my first conversation with Taika was, so look, 3 movies, and Loki's always somehow manages to, you know, pull the wool over Thor's eyes and get him to trust him and then betray him. What if Thor was onto him? What if Thor wasn't going to be fooled again, and it was actually Loki who was on the back foot? And so Thor's, you know, like, okay, Loki, I get it. You get me to trust you, then you betray me. Fine. You can keep playing the same tune if you like. I'm going to go off and do this. And Loki's almost nonplussed by that. It's like, what? So the shtick isn't working anymore? I'm going to have to think of something else. And that was really new. So in a way, like, Loki becomes the sort of straight man, and Thor becomes like off, and Thor's playing off that. And Loki has to think of like another way, a sort of a way of reinventing himself, because it isn't working. And there's a great scene where Loki, they sort of need each other to get out of the palace, the Grand Master's palace, played by Jeff Goldblum. And it works for a while, and they form this kind of unstable alliance, and then Loki betrays him again. And then Thor goes, it's not going to work like that. And then Thor betrays Loki and sort of stands over him and says, you know, you just never change, do you? Just the same over and over again. And Loki is so shocked by it.
I know I betrayed you many times before, but this time it's truly nothing personal. The reward for your capture will set me up nicely.
Never one for sentiment, were you?
Easier to let it burn.
I agree.
Yeah, it was just fun to kind of to send up some of the things that I had played with such sincerity in the previous films. And Taika is, you know, he comes from a background of independent filmmaking and comedy, and we improvised a lot. And I was really aware on that set of how kind of bonkers and funny this film was going to be. And Chris was so released as well because, I mean, everybody knows by now, but Chris is hilarious. And he always has been, ever since I met him. And he was kind of like, felt so free because Thor was kind of silly and, you know, there was a lot of a very endearing goofiness to what he was doing. Just joining in that atmosphere was really fun. And also that finally it sort of sets him on a road to kind of maybe setting down some of the old tricks and some of the old ways of doing things and reflecting and thinking, well, maybe, you know, if I can't provoke my brother anymore, maybe I should join him. I really enjoyed that ultimately the death of his father and the threat to his home, he's like, you know, I'm going to miss, who am I without Thor? If Thor is destroyed and Asgard is destroyed, I don't know who I am, so maybe I should be there. I should help them. I think it's really touching, I hope in a very unsentimental way. I mean, you didn't think I'd really come and see you, did you? This place is disgusting. Does this mean you don't want my help? Look, I couldn't jeopardize my position with the Grand Master. It took me time to win his trust. He's a lunatic, but he can be amenable. What I'm telling you is, you could join me at the Grand Master's side. Perhaps in time, an accident befalls the Grand Master, and then... What I love about Loki, the series, is it's the Loki you know in a world you don't know. This is the Loki who's mischievous and witty and charismatic and playful and transgressive and disruptive and broken and vulnerable and angry and betrayed and jealous and fractured and all these things, the whole cocktail. Someone who you can't trust, ever the trickster. But he's always someone who's somehow been in control. And he's suddenly in a world where he has no control. He's in a institution, a bureaucracy called the TVA, the Time Variance Authority. And they are an organization who have been tasked with the order of time. Reality unfolds as it should, according to its predetermined decisions.
Please sign to verify this is everything you've ever said.
This is absurd.
Sign this too.
And Loki is a character who basically inhabits the idea of chaos. And he's up against a bureaucratic institution that inhabits the idea of order. And you put those two together, and that's where we start. So, therein lies the drama.
You picked up the Tesseract, breaking reality. I want you to help us fix it.
Why me?
I need your unique Loki perspective.
Do I get a weapon?
Nah.
It is adorable that you think you could possibly manipulate me. And I love that about him. So suddenly you strip Loki of all the familiar stuff. Asgard, Thor, green, gold, helmets, magic, it's all gone. And you put him in a world where he's out of his comfort zone and destabilized and completely confused. And I really enjoyed seeing how he's almost confronted with having to find a new way through. And I hope that everyone is as excited by it as I was. Only Lovers Left Alive. Jim Jarmusch, Tilda Swinton, Mia Wasikowska, John Hurt, Anton Yelchin, Jeffrey Wright. I was so surprised and delighted to be asked to be involved in this. Jim had been writing a film for a while, I think, for about 5 or 6, maybe 7 years. It was really a film about a long-term relationship, and the two people in that relationship happened to be vampires. And so if you've made a commitment to be with someone, with one person for the rest of your life, but the rest of your life is forever, how does that change your commitment? And Jim and Tilda were long-time friends and collaborators, and he had very much written the part of Eve with Tilda in mind, and he just needed to find his Adam. And I remember meeting Jim in New York. He just kind of pitched me the film. He was like, so there's Adam and Eve, and they're vampires, but they're vegetarians. You know, they have like a deal with a doctor at a hospital who can get them the right blood, you know, and they really like the good quality stuff. And it was such an amazing idea anyway. And he said, you know, Adam is like, he's an artist and he's a musician, and he's younger than Eve. Eve is like 2,000 years old, and Adam is only 500 years old. But they're together and they love each other. But Adam lives in Detroit, and Eve lives in Tangier. And it's a kind of, sometimes they spend time apart because he likes to go and make music on his own, and he's kind of unhappy. He's inclined to the sort of the heaviness, the spiritual heaviness of the romantics, a pure romantic, somebody who feels everything, and can maybe perhaps he's even a little bit depressed, and he feels kind of burdened by the weight of the world on his shoulders, and that you know that life is unfolding, that reality and things happening on Earth are not going well, and he has a heavy heart, but it's a pure one, and it's an honest one, and it's kind of got this quite childlike sensitivity. And Eve is much wider and deeper and broader, and that she can contain him. I think it's called Only Lovers Left Alive for a reason. It really is about love and the power of real love and the endurance and durability of it, and how strong it is if it's real. And that true love is about acceptance and accepting somebody else for everything they are. And they're both artists. They both have this appreciation for literature and art and music and the finest things. And I learned a lot, not just about filmmaking from both Jim and Tilda, but also just about life. There's an amazing line that Eve says to Adam when he's feeling a bit low, and she needs to kind of pull him out of the place he's at in his mind, and she says,
"How can you have lived for so long and still not get it? This self-obsession, it's a waste of living that could be spent on surviving things, appreciating nature, nurturing kindness and friendship, and dancing."
And as advice goes, I don't know if you can get better than that. And then they put a record on, and it's Denise LaSalle, the record called Trapped by a Thing Called Love, and they dance and they smile and they fall into each other's arms. And I just thought it's a project that's very close to my heart, that one, for all kinds of reasons, yeah. Crimson Peak, Guillermo del Toro. This was, you know, again, it kind of came out of nowhere. I suddenly got a call saying, you know, I think I was in North America anyway, and they said, could you fly to Toronto next weekend to meet Guillermo del Toro? And I was like, sure. And I got on a plane and I met Guillermo, and he kind of met me straight off I arrived at the studio straight off the plane, and we sat down and had a cup of coffee or something, and he pitched me this film, a Gothic romance, in the manner of the great Gothic romance novels of English literature, Jane Eyre, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. He mentioned Bluebeard. There was a trope, essentially, in literature at a certain time where a young and pure-hearted heroine would meet a tall, dark stranger who lived in a big house on the hill, and they would fall in love, and then it turns out the tall, dark stranger was not as pure-hearted as perhaps she first thought, and maybe there were some skeletons in the closet or in the basement. And this was kind of a literary trope in that time. And he wanted to use that to make a version of that sort of film, but with a different sort of ending. The ghosts, rather than being somehow metaphorical, would be real, and that he'd be using the same techniques and craft and makeup to bring these ghosts from the past to life that he had used in his other films, particularly Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone. And it had a much more, actually quite a feminist inclination. You know, the heroine played by Mia Wasikowska, my second time working with Mia after Only Lovers Left Alive, she absolutely takes charge of her destiny in this. Good morning, miss. Forgive the interruption. I have an appointment with Mr. Carter Everett Cushing.
Goodness, with the great man himself.
I'm afraid so.
Sir Thomas Sharp, Baronet.
He'll be here shortly.
Thank you.
You're not late, are you? He hates that.
Not at all. In fact, I'm a little early.
Oh, I'm afraid he hates that too.
The film is about Edith's agency. And I play the tall, dark stranger who at first appears to be elegant and charming and full of promise and kind-heartedness, and there's a few secrets in his past and a sister that hasn't been accounted for, played by Jessica Chastain. Guillermo's knowledge of his craft, of the world of literature, of the world of Gothic romance, of cinema, of acting, of filmmaking is encyclopedic. And simply being a part of his crew was such a pleasure and a privilege, because he knows pretty much how to do every single job, and his kind of authority over his vision is total. And the attention to detail, the precision with which he works, he understood that you know, people do things for the reasons they have, and perhaps they're not aware of them, but sometimes, you know, characters make bad choices, but there's always a kind of emotional logic. So Thomas Sharp, a baronet, somebody who had inherited this crumbling mansion on a hill in northern England, who seems to be one thing and then is revealed to be another. And the one thing that's people may know about working with Guillermo is he writes very long and detailed biographies of each character. So when you're working with Guillermo, he submits you with a typed, almost novella of your character's life before the film starts. So you have this whole biography, a whole integrated psychology. You think, well, the reason he's like this is because this happened to him when he was a child, and he was sent away to this, you know, to this aunt who lived on the coast, and she didn't make nice food, and she was abusive, and all these kind of details which were so informative.
Goodness, how many rooms are there?
I don't know. Would you like to count them? What do you think? Does it look the part?
It does. Although it's even colder inside than out.
I know, it's a disgrace. We try to maintain the house as best we can, but with the cold and the rain, it's impossible to stop the damp and erosion. And also that set was... I remember we were in a studio in Toronto, and Allerdale Hall is the mansion that the Sharps live in. And he built a set that was on 3 or 4 stories. I think it's one of the biggest sound stages in North America, so we had to be there to fit this set inside it. And so that when you go upstairs, you would actually go upstairs, and when you walked along the landing, you could play. If somebody was on the ground floor, somebody could be on the 3rd floor landing, and you'd play these. I mean, it was like a real house. And there was one detail I remember, that the plaster of the wallpaper was cracking. And if you looked closely, the cracks in the plaster spelt out a word, and the word was fear. And he said, no one's ever going to catch that on camera. I just want you to know that it's there. And I thought, this guy is just, you know, where do you get that? You know, it was a really interesting journey to play that kind of archetype from Gothic romance, yeah. Archipelago, Edward, written and directed by the great Joanna Hogg, who really I owe everything to. She was the first director who gave me a job when I left drama school. It was an extraordinary first film for me, because Joanna almost invented for herself a new way of working, which was to take a script which had a story which went from A to Z or A to Z, and she decided to film it or shoot it chronologically. And most movies and films are shot out of sequence, and the actor's job is to know where you are in the story, because you know each piece of the jigsaw puzzle isn't in sequence. Whereas this was going to be, we're going to start at the beginning and finish at the end, and we lived through the story in sequence, and we improvised, even though the order of the scenes was the same. We actually improvised within the structure of the scene, and it can run for very long takes and very wide shots.
You look just like Dad with that on.
You do.
Oh, weird.
Way around.
No, it's the right
Yeah,
way
that's the
round.
right way round.
An archipelago is a collection of small islands scattered in a body of water. And they are, the archipelago in the film is the Isles of Scilly, or the Scilly Isles, which are about 25 miles off the coast of Cornwall in the UK. So very far south on the way into the Atlantic Ocean. And the location is where these older children, Edward is one of them, they're going off for one last family holiday. But you realize that the family itself is an archipelago, and each member of the family is an island in a group scattered in a body of water, and they're not quite connecting. All the actors live in the house where the characters live. And it's interesting, I think the effect is one of, you start to do things authentically and do things on camera in a very unaffected way. So if a character goes to make some eggs or make a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, because you're actually living there all the time, you do it, you're almost not acting it anymore. And similarly, in a very unusual way, we started at the beginning and we improvised our way through the whole story. It was kind of an extraordinary tuition in the honesty of film acting, which I owe to Joanna, because she loved the naturalism of the way real life is. It gave me a lot of insight into the kind of discipline that actors have to have about the truthfulness of what they're doing.
I've got one night to see her before I go away for 11 months. I don't know what's going to happen. And
So you're going to split up?
no, we're not going to split up.
Okay.
I don't know what we're going to do. I mean, actually, frankly, it would have been nice to have had her here with us now. I don't really see why she couldn't have come.
She couldn't really come here, could she? Because it was like a family holiday.
Edward in Archipelago was almost the first in a line of characters of people who felt, which is, I can only sort of tell looking back, is characters who felt that they were somehow misunderstood or slightly isolated within their own family. And it was quite strange, because I remember shooting Archipelago just before I went to Los Angeles to start making the first Thor film. And there were these strange connections I started making between Edward and Loki, which were that they're both siblings and they both feel misunderstood by their parents, and they're completely different films. I mean, the idea of Loki turning up in Archipelago is a puzzling one. Or the idea of Edward turning up in Thor with a kind of a scarf blowing in the wind. You know, it's kind of a fish out of water. But weirdly, I was kind of playing in the same territory psychologically, which is an interesting thing at the time. The Deep Blue Sea, we made it in the late fall, early winter of 2010, directed by Terence Davis and starring Rachel Weisz and Simon Russell Beale. And it's based on a play by Terence Rattigan. It's a very moving portrait of a woman who is trying to leave a very fragmented marriage and moving into an affair with a younger man in London in the 1950s, in the wake of the Second World War. And she falls in love with a young bomber pilot called Freddie Page, who I played. She feels slightly stranded between two men who offer her different things. It's really a film about unrequited love or the ways in which we misunderstand each other in our attempts to love. Terence Davis is a very poetic British filmmaker, and I found Terence very sensitive and caring and kind, and his knowledge of the perspectives of these three people. He was very attentive to both, to Rachel and to Simon and to myself, and understood that there really are no villains. Characters singing in pubs is almost a signature piece for Terence Davies, because he remembers as a child growing up in Liverpool that in those years after, Britain was not an easy place to be, because so many of the cities had been ravaged by the Second World War and communities had been diminished, and the economy had taken such a hit, and the 50s were quite hard for people to get through. But he remembers as a child, at a certain time of night, walking past the local pubs, and people would go to the pub and they would sing together as a group act. And so it almost in the Terence Davis thing to have people singing in pubs. And I loved that aspect of the filming. They sing a Joe Stafford song called You Belong to Me.
Just remember, darling, all the while, you belong to me.
And I think in the film, if I remember, it blends into them dancing together and having a very, very close, intimate moment, which is almost about the poignancy of being alive. They're so happy to be alive. And I think Freddie feels so privileged that he was one of his number in the Royal Air Force to come back, and that he's made it out. And to your second point, I think that's why he's so angry, is because there's a moment where Hester, Rachel's character, makes an attempt on her own life, which is unsuccessful. And Freddie is so enraged that she could be so careless with life, but he also doesn't have the sensitivity to contain her anxiety in that moment. And in his anger, you suddenly see all of his war trauma that actually he hasn't been able to unpack.
I know that I'm going to die. Just accept that it isn't your fault. It really isn't, Freddie. You can't help who you are. I can't help what I am. Well, I'm not carrying the can for this old darling. No dice. I'm not the villain of the piece.
No one is saying you are. Haven't you read what I wrote? I'm not blaming you.
I was the one who wanted to wait for the divorce. You didn't. You jumped that particular fence.
No, I never gave myself a big build-up. You knew exactly what you were getting.
Yes. I knew the risk I was taking, and I took it!
Oh, my God!